بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي أما بعد. All right, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you're calling in from. Alhamdulillah, here it's still not even Fajr. Fajr just came in, so inshallah, I'll take a minute after my presentation to do my salah, inshallah. But thank you all for logging on wherever and whenever you are. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this important conference, and I'd also like to apologize for missing some of the opening sessions. They were about 2 a.m. when they started here in California. Okay, so this is a paper, just to give a little bit of context for this. It's part of something that I've been working on for a while, and it's studying the ulama and trying to see, okay, the ulama as a group of people that are specialists in a particular form of knowledge, how do they differ from any other form of religious or any other form of elite or group? So in other words, if these are people that are specialists in ilm, in a particular form of knowledge, what makes them stand out and what makes their mode of engaging knowledge differ? So this comes partially from my own thesis, my own dissertation work in the book that I've been working on now, thinking about the ulama of contemporary Syria and the differences between the methodologies and modes of learning that exist between the ulama and my own kind of experiences in the academy as a PhD student, and somebody who's coming to the study of religion from a Western academic standpoint. I did my BA, MA, and PhD in religious studies, and so it's an area that all of my higher education is in this one area. Okay, so let's just get jumping into this then. So a few years ago, I published a short paper that was initially a blog piece titled "Being Bilingual: Thoughts on the Insider-Outsider Problem in Teaching Islam." There I spoke about the insider-outsider problem in the academic study of religion and drew attention to some voices that championed a strict outsider vantage point and some of the problems of such a view. I suggested that for some trained in both the madrasa and the modern academy, this was a lot like being bilingual, having to conform to two different languages and learning to code switch instinctively given the space that one is occupying. I suggested some options in the engagement between the madrasa and the modern academy: strict bilingualism, strictly using one language at one time, hybridity, or pigeonization. In this paper, I'd like to explore a little bit the question of what does it mean to study Islam? More specifically, what does it mean to study Islam in these two different contexts mentioned in the title of this conference, the Madrasa and the Modern Academy? Without focusing on the varying truth claims made by each institution. So, we hear a lot of this about methodology and their claims for truth and this and that. I'm not interested in that question because there's a lot of people asking that, and I think they probably have better answers than I will. What I'm asking is, what is one actually doing when they are studying Islam at a madrasa or the modern academy? Specifically, what is the sense of self that is being cultivated in these modalities in Islam? So I'm not interested in hearing like a theoretical thing, but more of just like, in a sense, a semi-anthropological question. So the argument of this paper is simple. To help think about this problem, I argue first that, one, the study of Islam, whether the madrasa or the modern academy, is what sociologists and anthropologists would refer to as a practice. The notion of practice that I draw upon is that of the moral philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre and its appropriation by Talal Asad in his conception of a discursive tradition. Asad draws our attention further to how a tradition is embodied and explores the notion of habitus. So given the notions of practice, tradition, and habitus, this leads us to another question. What does it mean to think of studying Islam at the madrasa and the modern academy as a practice? To answer this question, I'll focus on the madrasa and turn to Ibn Khaldun in his discussion of the craft of learning, Sina'at al-ilm, from his muqaddimah, and to provide a conception of talab al-ilm as a practice. Three important features emerge. One is textuality and canonicity. Two, interpersonal transmission, and three, a connection to the past. In undergoing this form of learning, there are attendant body practices that cultivate a particular sense of self. And the self that is working and functioning in Islamic learning is by no means an autonomous self that seeks to free itself from tradition, but rather a relational self, one that exists in relation to and measured against one's teachers as they convey knowledge to their students. So what I'm trying to draw attention to is this aspect of Islamic learning here. These three things, and just there's more to it than this, but these are the three that I'm just going to call out for this paper: the idea of textuality and canonicity, the idea of interpersonal transmission, and then a connection to the past and a relational self that's formed. Okay, so the idea of practice then. In his After Virtue, Alasdair MacIntyre describes a practice as any coherent and complex form of socially established human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially derivative of that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence in human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. Now, this is a really long sentence for a definition of practice here, but there's a lot to be unpacked in this, but there's a few points that I want to focus on. One is the key thing is undertaking a particular practice entails being initiated into a community of practitioners, wherein one subordinates oneself, at least in the initial stage, to a teacher and those already established within that community in order to learn the requisite skills and to meet the standards of excellence necessary to participate in that practice. While those standards of excellence are open to criticism and change over time, one cannot participate meaningfully in practice, much less a community, without first accepting the authority of the best standards realized thus far. Upon a practice, then, one is interpolated not only into a community, but also into a tradition that extends the history of that practice, from the past when it was developed to the present and into the future. A living tradition, according to MacIntyre, is, quote, a historically extended, socially embodied argument, an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition, end quote. To speak of a tradition in MacIntyre's terms is thus to speak about, it's just to speak of a practice and an attempt in the present to realize the practice is good in the future, while maintaining the standards of excellence and execution related to that practice's past. In other words, when you walk into a new area of learning, you can't just say, I'm going to do what I want here. You have to meet the standards that actually constitute excellence in that form of learning. So Talal Asad draws on some of MacIntyre's key ideas to develop a concept of discursive tradition. In a frequently cited passage from Asad's influential The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, he describes a discursive tradition in the following manner. A tradition he consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice that, precisely because it is established, has a history. So again, this is very much continuous to MacIntyre. These discourses relate conceptually to a past where the practice was instituted and from which the knowledge of its point and proper performance has been transmitted, and a future, how the point of that practice can be best secured in the short or long term, or why it should be modified or abandoned, through a present, how it is linked to other practices, institutions, and social conditions. So what Asad is drawing attention to is the contingency of all practices. Asad has noted that MacIntyre's notion of practice and tradition do not pay adequate attention to the embodied nature of a tradition. So there's this way of thinking about intellectual traditions as purely intellectual things. So the universities, the academy is just a series of doctrines and ideas and approaches. It has nothing to do with how you live and how you embody it. It's simply a series of teachings of orthodoxy and orthopraxy that have nothing to do with how you live, the pre-discursive elements of a tradition. Now, so the habitus and sense of self that are cultivated through practice. Now, so drawing on the writings of Marcel Mauss, Asad considers habitus from precisely this point, describing a habitus as that aspect of a tradition in which specific virtues are defined and the attempt is made to cultivate and enact them. What Asad's conception of a habitus ultimately draws our attention to are the embodied aspects of tradition, the physical aptitudes, the hierarchy, affect, and the sense of self that one seeks to willingly cultivate through participating in a practice and being part of a tradition. Okay, so that's this notion of practice that I'm trying to use here as a framework to think about what it means to be in the madrasa, what it means to study traditionally in a traditional setting. So I want to expand on this now using turning to Ibn Khaldun. So the notions of practice and habitus just discussed resonate with the description of Islamic learning given by Ibn Khaldun in his magnum opus, the Muqaddimah. Drawing on an Aristotelian theory of action, Ibn Khaldun considers science, ilm, as a craft, as a sina'a, whose chief feature is the possession of a malaka. This is the key term that's going to be important for us here, is the idea of malaka. So Franz Rosenthal rendered malaka as a habit in his translation of the Muqaddimah, but Malaka is perhaps more accurately understood as habitus in the manner in which Asad conceived it. A malaka, according to Ibn Khaldun, is a firmly rooted attribute, sifa rasikha, that is ideally learned from a teacher, but can be attainable with lesser proficiency without one, and that is acquired through repetition. Ibn Khaldun's theory of action maintains that an action done once merely adds an attribute to the soul, though with some degree of repetition, this attribute becomes a longer lasting one, a hal. Through persisting in that state with increased repetition over an extended period of time, this attribute ultimately becomes firmly rooted characteristic, a malaka. With respect to ilm, a malaka of learning is the cultivation of a particular mode of thinking, the habits and skills of mind, particular to a field of science. In Ibn Khaldun's words, science is a, quote, habitus which enables its possessor to comprehend the first principles and the maxims of that particular science, mabadi' and the qawaid, and to know the problems that it investigates, the masail. 3, to extract derivative rulings from its principles, so the furu' from its usul. If somebody has this, they have malaka. So he continues, as long as a malaka has not been obtained, skill in a particular discipline is not forthcoming. So the central element for him, for Ibn Khaldun, is malaka, is having this habitus. It is the possession of this habitus, according to Ibn Khaldun, that distinguishes a scholar from others involved in the practice of Islamic learning. A beginner, for example, might learn the nomenclature and questions that a particular discipline investigates, but not yet grasp its first principles, and is thus unable to further scholarly discourse to produce ilm. Similarly, the encyclopedist that has memorized the relevant source text and the various positions regarding the central questions of a discipline, but has not internalized the first principles and guidelines, the qawaid and the usul and the mabadi', is also incapable of furthering science. Despite obtaining a certain status in the practice, both the novice and the encyclopedist, according to Ibn Khaldun, are not truly scholars because they have not cultivated the requisite scholarly habitus. If we are to consider Islamic learning as a practice, then, as Ibn Khaldun makes the case for us, what are some of its key features? So I'll draw attention to just 3 that characterize Islamic learning for our purposes here, namely the textual and canonical dimension, the interpersonal mode of learning, and then 3, the sense of transmission and connectivity to authorities of the past. While these are not unique to Islamic learning and have analogs in a variety of other learning practices, such as rabbinics or Brahmanic learning or Buddhist learning, and I would say actually to a degree in Western learning too, they're manifest in a particular way within Sunni Islam. Okay, so the first is this notion of textuality. So perhaps the most prominent aspect of Islamic learning is its textual and canonical nature. And there are 2 levels of textuality and canon that I distinguish. On the one hand, there are the texts that constitute the source material for Islamic thought and civilization, which I refer to as the source canon for Islamic thought, at the center of which is the Quran, then the Hadith, and all the main body of literature that forms the sources for Islamic teachings. And then in contrast to this primary level of textuality, Islamic learning, however, consists of a body of texts produced by scholarly authorities over the centuries, derived from and managing access to the source canon. This body of text represents the myriad disciplines that constitute Islamic learning. While the history and emergence of those texts has only recently begun to receive attention by scholarship, in many respects, these works are distillations of and are related to earlier works from the Islamic source canon and function primarily, though not exclusively, as teaching texts. I refer to these as the didactic canon. So you have your source canon, which is your big collections of hadith, your big collections of tafsir and language and dictionaries and so on. Then you have your didactic canon, which is the text that you actually study when you're in madrasas.
5 minutes, Professor Qureshi.
Now, right. So their primary function being not the collection, preservation, and cataloging of teachings, but the articulation of the most authoritative positions within a discipline of learning for educational purposes. Right. So there's this textuality that goes into the Islamic learning, a particular form of textuality too. The second part here is the interpersonal sense of transmission. So texts, though necessary, were hardly sufficient. Who one studied under was just as important as what one studied. So using the example of the Quran again, just as the Quran did not emerge without the Prophet ﷺ, so too Islamic learning emphasized the embodiment of learning in teachers. Ibn Khaldun, for whom, as we saw, Malaka was the key aspect of learning, notes that, quote, the skill a student acquires in a craft and the Malaka he attains correspond to the quality of instruction and the Malaka of the teacher. In his masterpiece on legal theory, the Muwafaqat, the Andalusian jurist Abu Ishaq al-Shaltibi stressed the importance of interpersonal learning from teachers. And he says, and while Shatibi acknowledges that in theory one could develop a malaka of a particular discipline independent of a teacher, he is keen to emphasize that this was rare and that learning under an expert scholar, a mutahaqqaq, was the only beneficial way of acquiring knowledge. To this end, Shatibi records a saying prominent in his time and that reflects both the textual dimension of Islamic learning as well as its interpersonal transmission. He says, at first knowledge was in the breasts of men, then it moved to books, and the key to those books are now in the hands of men. What is of central importance to Shatibi is that the student should cultivate religious knowledge under the care of expert scholars and work toward internalizing their comportment and habitus, in the same way that, according to Sunni conceptions of Islamic origins, the companions were shaped and modeled and molded through their association with the Prophet ﷺ. A statement of the Prophet's wife, Aisha, Aisha, is often cited to emphasize the notion of embodying knowledge. When asked about the Prophet ﷺ's character, she responded, Kana khuluquhu al-Quran. His character was the Quran. So you see this embodiment of texts in the person of the Holy Prophet ﷺ as well. The third element here is this notion of connectivity to the past. So the canonical and interpersonal character of Islamic learning entail a third related feature, namely a sense of connectivity to past authorities through the transmission of Islamic learning. And so for the interest of time here, I'll pause at this section here, but there's just clearly a sense we all have that, we all know that from, there is this sense that this, what, scholars in the West call it the Isnad paradigm, like William Graham mentioned that, he called it the Isnad paradigm, which is a good description because it highlights this idea that people are connected in their forms of learning and that texts are also connected and that texts are transmitted. So what we have then are these two tiers of Islamic textuality. The source canon as well as the didactic canon are not simply taught to students, but they're also transmitted to students. And what you have then is this sense that students are interpolated into the Islamic discursive tradition as new links now in that chain of transmission. So what I want to note here, just by way of, what's the point in all this? What I want to draw attention to is not simply that, there's elements of the academy that they believe this and we believe that, and that we're pious, they're not pious, or they're somehow objective and we're not objective. I think that's okay. Everyone kind of knows that in a sense. But what I want to draw attention to is, well, what's actually happening in terms of the self that you cultivate? What type of individual emerges from this? How does that individual relate to other things and relate to textuality, relate to other individuals, and so on and so forth. I don't mean here authority in the sense that one is now made a jurist or made a faqih or made an imam or made a religious functionary of some kind, but I'm talking strictly about the subjective self here and how it relates to other things. I think that's fundamentally that's a fundamental difference between the two projects of the Western Academy and the modern madrasa. Or the modern academy and the modern madrasa too, I guess. Now, of course, what complicates this is that when you have madaris that function like modern academies, which is a growing phenomenon, and then when you have, and this doesn't preclude the option that the Western academy doesn't have a sense of embodiment, interpersonal transmission, and so on. That's very much there. It's present in some areas, perhaps not as admitted, as foregrounded as in other places. So those are just some ideas I wanted to share in terms of thinking about the difference here between what's happening in learning, right? And turning our conversation a little bit away from, or maybe bringing a new dimension of what it means to embody a tradition, as opposed to simply talking about doctrinal points and methodological, epistemological points. I'll pause here and I'll take some questions at the end, inshallah. Barakallah.